In this video, I want to talk about building our own custom hooks in React. And building our own custom hooks will allow us to take logic from our components and extract it and turn it into something that is reusable. So a hook is really just a function. It can take in any number of parameters and it can return anything. A hook in React can also use the other hooks that come from React. So it can use the state hook, it can use the effect hook, it can use the layout effect hook, it can use the ref hook, etc., etc. So what I'm going to do is walk through the example on the documentation page for React, though I do recommend reading this on your own and sort of parsing it at your own speed. And after we go through this, I'll show you a couple of examples, and then we'll dive into applying this to our movie rating app. Okay. So setup for this example is, imagine that we've got this chat API and we want to be able to display whether or not people are logged into this chat API. So what the React docs here are showing is one component that displays someone's status. So we're going to pass in as the prop the ID of that friend, and this is going to display either loading, online, or offline. That's what it returns. This component connects to the API to go ahead and figure out which of these things should be displayed. So up here, we have a piece of state, is online. It starts off as null. And then once we connect, we will change it from null to either online, to either true or false. So we've got that initial state. And then we have an effect here, which is responsible for doing the asynchronous action of talking to the API. So it subscribes to this imaginary chat API where it passes in the ID from our props and says, whenever that friend status changes, run this function. That function just changes our state. So it changes it from true to false, it changes it to true or false based on whether or not that friend is logged in. So that's the gist here. We have a component that's kind of doing two things. It is doing this rendering logic of determining what should show up on the screen, and it's doing this state logic of figuring out whether or not the user is online. And these two things are the things that we're going to learn how to separate out as we go through this tutorial. The next bit that the React docs are showing is that there is a friends list item component. So there's another place on the page where you want to display whether or not people are online. So that same logic is duplicated here, and then something else is returned. So instead of it being loading online, offline, here they're displaying a list item in either green or black based on whether the user is online. So when we are in this kind of hook mindset, what we can do is extract this shared logic that's being used in both of these components to a custom hook that we can then use in both of those places. So scrolling down here, this is their example of creating a custom hook. So a custom hook is just a function. Notice the convention here. So this is important. We're going to start all of our hook function names with use. And this is camel case instead of Pascal case. So lowercase u. So the hook is just a function. It takes in something and it returns something. And these are completely up to you, what it takes in and what it returns. So this hook is taking in an ID and then it is returning whether or not that ID is online. So you're going to see pieces that are extracted from these snippets. So we've got a piece of state. So our custom hooks can use the state hook. We see our effect again. So our custom hooks can use the effect hook. So that logic in here is the same as before. So it is just checking whether or not the user is online by subscribing to the chat API and using that to change the is online state variable to true or false. Then when it comes time to use it, here's our first component, our friend status. All we do is write the name of that function, then we invoke it and pass in any parameters it needs, and we get back whether or not we're online. So this friend status component is much smaller, and it is really just about figuring out what the view should be, what the markup on the page should be. That's its concern. And then our use friend status is what's responsible for the logic of like actually talking to that API. So you split both of those things. And here's our friend list item. Same deal. We can use our friend status hook. And now all this component really cares about is figuring out the markup, figuring out the styling here of our list item, whether it's in green or black. So these two components are drastically simpler than the first two that we saw up here. And there is no duplication of this logic across these two components. That has now been extracted to a custom hook. So just kind of to drive that home, it is allowing us to extract our logic and then also make it reusable. A couple other examples. There is a use hooks website, so usehooks.com has a few recipes that are helpful as you're kind of learning about how to write your own custom hooks. So a couple that I want to highlight. Use local storage is one where you pass in the key in local storage where you want to store a value and the initial value. So this looks a lot like our use state hook that comes from React. And then the implementation of it is here, which we don't really have to spend the time understanding it, but basically it's creating a piece of state, and it is returning. It's returning at the end the value and a function to set that value. So then anywhere in your project, once you have that, you can use that hook to create a piece of state that is synced to local storage. So if you close the browser and open it up again, you will still have that information saved. Another one here is the use window size. So this is one that tracks how big the browser is and gives that to you. So you use it like this, no parameters passed in, and then it returns to you an object with a width and height property. And then the logic, again, we don't really have to dig into it to understand what's going on here, but it is storing a piece of state for width and height. It has an effect, a side effect that runs when the component mounts that listens for the browser's resize event. And anytime the browser is resized, it just grabs the window's inner width and window's inner height and sets it to our window size. So this takes in no parameters, stores some state, and then returns the latest version of the window size. So anywhere where you use this hook, you will get the window size pulled in, and anytime the window changes, this app component here would re-render. So hooks are a really powerful way for us to pull out logic from our components. So our logic in our rendering components becomes a lot simpler, and then we're able to create these reusable chunks of logic that we can potentially have shared across multiple components. So for this one, I'll have a starter file set up that you can download and use. It is going to be the last version of the movie rating app. We're just going to take some of our components that we wrote without custom hooks and write them with custom hooks. So as you're downloading this, make sure that you set up your env like we have before. So you are going to take this template, copy and paste it, rename it so that it is .env.local, and fill in all of these variables with your Firestore credentials. Then you're going to run npm install to install all the dependencies, and then you can boot up your server by running npm run start. So this will be hooked up to your Firestore database. I have it hooked up to the movies from wherever this was left last in the last video. So I have a few movies in here. This loads. Looks like I've got 2 color out of space from some kind of local testing that I was doing. So I'm going to go ahead and delete one of those. I've got a few movies in here. So we just want to at least have a couple pieces of data to work with as we're getting started here. So the roadmap for what I want to do is all of those components where we were actually talking to Firebase, where we were doing some kind of hefty logic. For instance, our movie listing, I want to extract this where we were loading our movies into another hook. So the hook, I want to just be able to give me back the movies, the loading state, the error message, so that this component won't need any of this in it. And this will be a lot simpler. Like our component will just be focused on taking those pieces of state and figuring out what should happen to them when the rendering is happening down here. And this component won't have to worry about the sort of intricacies of talking to that API. So we're going to do that for our movie listing. We will probably also do that for our add movie component, where we were adding a movie, and our edit movie component, where we were loading some data for a particular movie, and then we were editing that movie. So what I want to start with is movie listing. For this tutorial, I am just going to create another folder where I'm going to put all of my hooks. This will work for the kind of size of application we're building currently, but the bigger your application, the more you're going to kind of want to separate things by features. So we might have a folder for all of our movie related components and hooks that keeps them together. But for this, what I'm going to do, I'm going to create a new file, use all movies.js, and this is going to be my custom hook. So I'm going to create a function in here. It's really important that it starts with use, and we're also going to follow the convention of making this camel case. So the first letter of the first word is lowercase. And then into this component, we essentially just want to bring all of this logic. So I'm going to cut this from this component, which will break it temporarily. We'll come back and fix it. And I'm going to put it into this this hook here. So this hook, I'm going to need to bring in the use state hook and the use effect hook from React. So I'm going to go ahead and import use state, use effect from React. And I believe we also need our movie collection. Yes, movies collection here. So I'm going to go ahead and import movies collection from data Firebase. So this particular hook, let me collapse it. We don't need any parameters here. So this hook, when we invoke it, we just want it to go off, talk to the API, and grab all of the results from our movies collection. So no parameters needed for this one. And what we want it to return at the end here, give us the movie data, give us whether or not we're loading, and give us an error message. So it's returning 3 pieces of state here in an array. And when we bring it into our movie listing, we'll have access to all 3 of those things. So we'll have a variable that tells us whether we're loading, gives us the error message, and another one that gives us all of the movies. Okay, so I'm going to clean this up. I'm going to get rid of some of these comments since, yeah, I'm going to get rid of that comment as well to keep this a little bit more trim. So our logic here is going to be the same. It's just that we're moving it to a custom hook. So our effect runs as soon as this hook is used, and it sets loading before anything. It sets up a function for handling when we get some data. It sets up a function for handling when there's an error, and then it kicks off our subscription to our movies collection. So it sorts them by rating in descending order, and then says, whenever you get a snapshot, call this function. If it's successful, call this function if there's an error. So if it's successful, we go ahead and stop loading, and we store those movies into our state. If there's an error, then we display this error message, and we're also dumping it to the console for us as developers. As I'm looking at this, I think we have a bug from before. So if it errors out, we want to make sure that we also stop the loading state. So we've got on next, on error, and then the last bit here that we implemented before is just making sure that it unsubscribes. So when this hook is no longer used, this unsubscribe method that function that we're returning here will be called, so we'll no longer be notified when the movie's collection changes. So really there's nothing that, I mean, I fixed a little bug here, but aside from that, there's nothing that changed in us extracting this into a hook. So then what I'm going to do, let me make sure that I export use all movies before I do this next thing. So I'm going to export default use all movies, and then I'm going to go ahead and import this into movies listing. So I can get rid of some of these imports. We no longer need state and effect here. And then I can import use all movies from, go up a directory into my hooks folder, use all movies. So we're going to use this like we do other hooks. So I'm going to say use all movies here. And then what's returned is determined by the logic that we put into our hook. So in this case, if I bring them side by side, we are returning the movie state, the is loading state, and the error message state. So I can destructure those here. And these variable names don't have to match up with what I'm returning here. I'm just returning an array that has these three things in it. And here I'm using array destructuring to pull out the first thing into this variable, the second thing into this one, the third thing into this one. These could be named whatever you want. Okay, now I give this a save. See that there are no errors in my console. And if I flip back to the browser, make sure there's nothing popping up here at runtime, all of my movies are showing up. I should still be able to kind of interact with my database and get real-time updates. So as I deleted one of those things, my hook updated and this page updated. So there's our first custom hook. It really didn't involve a ton, and it had these nice benefits of our movie listing component is now more modular. This movie listing does not care at all about how the movies are loaded and how this error message comes about and how this data gets pulled from Firebase. It just cares about the current state. And then our use all movies hook is the thing that's responsible for actually talking to the API. And this hook does not care at all about how the page looks. It is just responsible for retrieving that data and managing our state here. Okay, first hook done. Movie listing, we're good. The next thing I want to do is create one that allows us to, in our edit movie, load the current movie here. So the way our edit movie worked is we had this effect that ran, that pulled the data for a movie when we went to the page. So if I click on get out, it pulled that data, displayed that spinner, and then put the data into our form. So this logic here can be extracted into its own hook. This hook is going to be a little bit different than our previous hook in that there is something that we want to pass in here. So our logic for getting a movie required an ID. So we will now create a hook that is going to do all of this. So it's going to be responsible for the loading state, the error message, the movie data, and it's actually also going to take a parameter. So I'm going to head to my hooks folder, create a new file. I'm going to call this usemovie.js, and I'm going to create a function Same convention. We're going to start this with use. It's going to be camel case, use movie. It is going to take an ID as a parameter. And we're going to need to bring in use state, use effect from React, and we're also going to need to bring in our movies collection from data Firebase. Make sure that before I forget, I export this. Okay, so I have a function, it takes an ID, and then the meat of this function is just going to be the same logic that we had here. So it's going to be, let me separate this out a little bit. This logic is loading error message movie data, is the chunk for loading a specific movie, and then this plus our on movie submit is the chunk for saving edits. So I just want to grab the stuff that is responsible for getting a specific movie. I'm going to cut that, give this a save, which will temporarily break things. We will fix it when we finish writing our hook here. So my use movie hook is loading error message movie data. It sets those up as state, and then we want to make sure that it returns those. So I'm going to return movie data is loading error message. And again, I'm using arrays here, so I'm returning an array that has these three things so that we can destructure them into local variables inside of our component that actually uses the hook. So our logic doesn't really have to change much here. I'm looking through, we've got our effect still, and this effect has a dependency. Anytime the ID changes, this effect will rerun. And when this effect runs, it calls this asynchronous function, our getMovie function, sets loading to true, attempts to grab that movie and store it into our movie data piece of state. And if there's an error, it goes ahead and displays an error message. So again, no real changes to the logic made here. I'm just moving things out of my rendering component and isolating the logic from the rendering. So I've got use movie. I can head back to edit movie. I can import this hook. So import use movie from hooks, use movie. And I'm going to rearrange these slightly. I like to put, whoops, hit the wrong hotkey. Now I'm going to rearrange them. I like to put my CSS at the end after the rest of my imports. So here, now that I've got use movie, I can use it here like I would other pieces of state. And what I need to pass in is any parameters I've defined. Here I've said, okay, this hook, it needs to know the ID to be able to look up the movie. And then what gets returned here is what I defined down here. The movie data, whether or not it's loading, and the error message. So movie data is loading, error message. And again, these variables don't have to be named the same thing. They're just matching the position in the array. Give this a save. Go back here, click on one of these with edit, and the logic is exactly the same, no errors. This pulled that data, then loaded it into the form. So the last hook that I want to write is one that will handle our submitting on the edit page, which was reaching into the movies collection, grabbing the ID to look up the doc, and then updating what was in that document. So I want to extract this into a hook. And also in our add movie page, we did something very, very similar. It basically was the same logic, except instead of looking up a doc, we went ahead and just added a new one. So I want to design a hook that can handle both of these situations because they're so similar. And this hook is going to be a little bit different than our previous hooks. So what I want from this hook is this. So I want to create a hook here that gives me back a function that I can run when I'm ready to save. I want it to tell me whether or not we're saving currently, so that I can potentially, you know, what we did here was we updated our movie form to disable it when we were saving. And I also want that form message that we were using here. So we were saying, great, save successfully. And we also had one here where, oh, something went wrong, so try again. So I want all of those things to come back from this hook. So let me comment this out while we write the hook. So I'm going to call this one use save movie.js. Same deal, create a function, same convention. No parameters for this one. Make sure that I export this function, and then I can start bringing over from our edit movie this logic. I'm just going to grab all of this, and we're going to have to rearrange some of the parts. So I can see that I'm using state here. I'm not using effect anywhere, so all I need to do to set this up is import use state from React. It's the only hook I need from React. And then I can also see I'm using the movies collection, so I'll make sure that I import movies collection from data Firebase. So what I said I wanted to return was a save function and then these two pieces of state. So I'm going to rename this function here to be save. And I'm going to return save is saving form message. And I'm going to change this slightly. So I'm going to get rid of this commented out thing. And instead of getting 3 separate parameters here, I'm going to say the save function accepts movie data. So you're just going to pass it an object that has the title, rating, release year, and anything else that should be in the movie data, like the review or the genres. So once I've changed that, then my set down here needs to update so that I am setting it to this object. I can also see that I need my ID here. So I'm also going to say that the save function, you tell it the movie data, and then you also tell it what is the ID for that movie. So those are the only real changes here. I've changed what the parameters are to this function and renamed it to be save. So I'm going to give this file a save, and then if I go back to edit movie and I import save movie from hooks save movie, or whoops, this should be use save movie. Now I can uncomment this. So I have my save function and I have these 2 pieces of state. So I no longer need to create those pieces of state here. And my on movie submit, that is still running as normal. It still gets title, rating, and release year from the form. But the logic inside of here that needs to run is just call that save function. So I'm going to pass in the title, rating, and release year as an object. And I'm also going to say, here's the ID, here's where that should be saved. And then I'm going to make sure that I save this file, head back to the browser. I've got no errors so far, so my all movies still works. Add movie. Let's put in a test here that has a rating of 1. Give it a save. Saved successfully. I can see that movie over here. So we've oh, you know what? Actually, I just did the wrong logic. What am I thinking? We were working on our edit movie component, not our add movie component. We're going to fix that in a second. So actually what I want to do is test out the edit flow. So we saw that we had got the movie successfully with our get movie hook. And then to edit it, now I will change something, hit save, see that it was successful, head back over here, see that it changed. So we have successfully refactored our logic. here into two separate hooks. We have our use movie hook and our use save movie hook. So then the last thing to do to finish extracting all of our database logic into these hooks is if we look at our add movie, we had very, very similar logic here, except that, let's bring these side by side. In our now use save movie hook, when we wanted to add something, we said movies collection .doc ID and then used the set method to supply the information. When we are adding a new movie, we use the add method on the movies collection to be able to add. So we want our use save movie hook here to be able to handle the situation when the ID is there. So here, when we're editing something, we've got to go ahead and look up that doc by ID. But also to handle the situation where if there's no ID supplied, let's just go ahead and add a new one. So let me make this full screen again. So what we want to do is check that ID. So if our ID is undefined, whoops. Hit a few wrong hotkeys there. Okay, if our ID is undefined, then this is where we want to do our logic from add movie. So I'm just going to flip back over to add movie and copy and paste this. So here we are talking to the movies collection, we're running add, and then we're going to pass in that movie data. So if there's no ID, go ahead and add the movie. Otherwise, that means we do have an ID, so we can just look up that document and set the movie data there. So we have made our ID optional. If I, let's see, let's pull up this side by side with edit movie. So when we call this save function here, which is this function that we defined over here, if we don't pass in an ID, that makes the ID variable undefined inside of our function. So that would mean that add would be called. And as soon as we pass in a specific ID, it goes ahead and runs this branch where it looks up the document and sets the data there. So what I can do is bring save movie over to my add movie. Let's import use save movie from hooks, use save movie. I'm just reordering these lines here so that my CSS is at the bottom. Okay, so my save movie makes these two lines obsolete. I no longer need to create my own state here because that is managed by my hook. And then this function can be simplified to just run save and pass in an object that has title, rating, release here. Can get rid of all this logic since it's duplicated. And so this, because we are not passing in that ID, the ID is undefined. So our use movie will, whoops, not use movie, use save movie will end up running this add because our ID is undefined. So let me give this a save. And now let's test the write flow here. So I've got edit pulled up. So I'm going to go to add movie. I'm going to call this new movie, give it a rating of 1, 2000. Hit save, save successfully. Make sure it shows up here. We have our new movie with a rating of 1. My listing still works as I delete it. So at this point, we've effectively refactored our components so that the database logic no longer is in our components. That is in a separate hook. And I can see, maybe there's a little bit of cleanup to do. I can see some warnings here that we have some unused variables. And these are coming from the fact that we just moved those state variables in our movie collections logic into our hooks. So up here, I can see these are grayed out. I don't need these anymore. Get rid of that. Get rid of that. Give this a save. Check out add movie. or edit movie. Yep, same deal. We no longer need the movie collection. We no longer need our use state, use effect. Check out our movie listing since we changed that one too, and we already did that cleanup here. And I see this comment is still here for when we were learning about use effect. I'm just going to go ahead and move that into my use all movies to keep it with our first time we used our effect. Okay, so this approach is really powerful because it allows us to break our components apart. So we no longer have these monolithic files. We can kind of turn them into separate modules. And to convince you of that, let me pull up our starter files and compare it to where we ended up here. Try and get these side by side. I might have to zoom out slightly. Okay, so let's look at maybe our movie listing component and compare here. So our movie listing component over here, there's a little bit of magic happening in that we're getting these pieces of state from use all movies, but it makes it really easy for us to figure out like, okay, well, once we have those things, then, you know, the user interface displays a loading spinner. If that's true, it displays an error message if there is one, and it loops over the array of movies and displays them. The sort of rendering logic is more clear in this one because we don't have to read from start to finish and think like, oh, okay, there's some state here, then there's this effect that's running, and then we get down to the rendering. So by using these custom hooks, we can make our components more legible. And then in the case of our add movie and edit movie, not only did it become more legible in that like our add movie has less logic in here than it does over here, but this logic was duplicated on 2 of our pages. So by centralizing that and putting that into a hook, we saved ourselves some copy and pasting, and we made it easier to maintain going forward. Because if we decide to, you know, over here change whatever success message we get back from the hook, from this submission is, we have to do it in 2 places. We have to do it in add movie and edit movie here. In our refactored project, we just go to use save movie and change it in one place. Give it a save, and now anytime we go ahead to save the movie, we get back that new saved your movie response as opposed to save successfully. Okay, so that is all there is to adding hooks to our project. When you're thinking about designing your own hooks, you really want to think about what are those parameters that you need to give to your hook, and what is the hook return. So our different hooks here, we had some that had a parameter, some that didn't, and we had 2 hooks that kind of had this same format of returning 3 pieces of data, but we also had this hook here that returned a function along with 2 pieces of data. So it's really up to you to design your hook to your purposes, figuring out what parameters you need and what gets returned. And with this, you should be all set to try bringing hooks into your final project.